Good morning, everybody. This is Carrie Getz with Strategicom and another edition of our podcast series. Today, I'm thrilled to be interviewing Dr. Julie Albright. She's a digital sociologist, a keynote speaker. She's a board member on the Infrastructure Masons, which we've highlighted several times on this podcast series. They've got great scholarships that are available, and 50% of the scholarship dollars are earmarked to getting women careers in this industry, which is pretty great. Julie is a sociologist specializing in digital culture and communications. She currently lectures at the Department of Applied Psychology and Engineering at USC, where she teaches master's level courses on the psychology of interactive technologies and sustainable infrastructure. She's been on several news shows, including The Today Show, CNN, NBC, CBS, talking about her book, Left to Their Own Devices, How Digital Natives Are Reshaping the American Dream. And we'll have a link to that book. It's really a great read that talks about how the young kids and the next generation coming up that have grown up with devices in their hand, how their life is different and their expectations are different. And we'll talk a bit about that here shortly. We're also thrilled to announce she's got a new book coming out, The Cloud Machine, which she co-authored with Dean Nelson, that peels back the curtain of data centers and the people who run them. Dean is a founder of the Infrastructure Masons, and he started out working at PayPal, then at eBay, then at Uber. He's currently on the board of several different upcoming companies and the interim CEO for Virtual Power Systems, which is also a very cool technology. But anyway, Julie, welcome to our show. Tell us about yourself.
Hey, thank you so much, Carrie, for having me. It's really great, and I love what you're doing around jobs and awareness. So I'm Dr. Julie Albright. I'm coming to you live from University of Southern California. I'm a digital sociologist over here, which means I look at the impact, basically, of digital technologies on society. And I have a dual doctorate, and I actually have two masters and a dual doctorate. So the other half of my education and training is in counseling. So what I do is I look at the large sociological trends afoot that are impacting all of us, and then I kind of take it down to the impacts on the ground and think about our relationships, our families, our communities, and our workplaces, for example, and how the intersection of digital technologies are really changing all those vectors.
That's really important because a lot of things have changed. But we know that employees, millennials specifically as employees, behave differently and expect different things in the workplace. They certainly look at different benefits. They have different priorities from a hiring perspective. And one of the things that's come up on this podcast quite a few times is the fact that, a lot of these kids, especially the Gen Zers, are coming out with a ridiculous amount of debt. And that's part of the reason that we really talk about trades and veterans and other paths to the industry that don't necessarily involve that debt. Because once you start working for some place, a lot of them will pay for your college education anyway. But we have noticed, talking to a lot of the folks, that the younger generation doesn't seem to have a big sense of loyalty when it comes to working for a company. If another company comes along with better pay, they're good to go. And so part of that, I think, ties into some of what you've been talking about, people being untethered. So tell us exactly what you mean when you say somebody's untethered.
Right. Well, it's funny because I just came from a lunch with some of the professors from the petroleum engineering program here at USC. We were talking about that very word, the word loyalty. My mentor was the CTO of Chevron, and he was at Chevron for 34 years. And, that kind of loyalty you're not seeing now. And, the average job hopping time now is about 18 months for millennials, for example. And so I think part of that has to do with cultural and expectation changing around, again, being driven by digital technologies. I call it the double helix of behavior and technology, where, behavior is shaping technology and technology shaping behavior. And when you look at that, digital culture spins fast. If you look at the Instagrams or the TikToks or any of the apps like that are social and popular with young folks, Snapchat. In fact, Snapchat, classic example, there is no history at all. Your snaps fade away. And for the most part, with things like Instagram or TikTok, you're only as good as your last video or picture that you posted. You're on this news feed that's constantly changing, constantly being upgraded. with something new, something different, the new person, whatever it might be, the new content. And so I think these kids get used to a life that spins very fast. My mentor, for example, asked his class one day, they used to say, "What's your 5-year plan?" The people all said, "We're supposed to have a 5-year plan." So, he's in his 70s now, and he says to his students, "Well, what's your 5-year plan?" And they looked at him like he was crazy. What are you talking about, 5-year plan? Like, to them, that's like an eon. It might as well be a 100-year plan. So, it kind of took him aback because that was such a standard way of thinking back in the day, but now it seems insane. So, this idea that you've got a huge generation that have grown up since childhood, at least middle school or onward, with a world where there always was an internet, increasingly where, we had these internet enabled devices, mobile devices like phones or iPads and things. And, for kids now growing up, they grew up in a world of mobility. So you've got that going on. You've also got a much more diverse workforce coming in. So, for example, if you look at the baby boomers who are a lot of the population of upper management, it's about 72% white. But if you look at millennials, they're only 56% white, and that number is dropping as you get younger. So you've got a workforce that's coming in as what we call digital natives, that they've grown up in this world, unlike baby boomers. They've grown up in a world where there always was an internet, and they're a much more diverse group. So this is a young population that comes in with different values, different life experiences, and different motivational and behavioral drivers, I would suggest, that are increasingly orbiting around digital connectivity, social media, and things like texting. So that really reshapes how they think work should be, what their expectations are for their jobs and their workforce and their workplace and their work time. And it's really reshaping everything in terms of their relationship with the workplace.
Yeah, I can honestly say in tech, I've seen a lot of this change. When I started in tech, if somebody worked someplace for more than about 3 years, people wanted to know what was wrong with them because they had new skills, they were worth more in the marketplace, and cost of living raises just didn't cut it. So to hear that that's gone down to 18 months, that's pretty crazy. And I think, too, one of the other things that I've changed, and I know women, we're not really good at tooting our own horns anyway, but, this whole culture of instant gratification and instant approval, I think has definitely made it different in the workforce.
Yes, and that's one of the changes. I call that "don't care how, I want it now." You can order food with the touch of a button on your phone. You can order a car to come pick you up, or entertainment on demand on Netflix, for example. So this idea of wanting it now, getting it now, it becomes an expectation, and that's sort of bleeding over into the workforce. For example, young employees expect a promotion now within 1 year. I had the senior VP of Huawei came into my class a year ago and gave a talk about basically how he was coming to have dinner with me, and gave a talk about how to move up the career ladder and create a career and things like that. I thought he'd be a great sort of role model for the students. And he talked about that. And at the end of the talk, he said, "Well, are there any questions?" Gal pops up her hand and she says, now they're going to graduate in a couple of months. And she says, "Now I'm applying for all these jobs, and all the jobs I'm getting offered are entry level. How do I start out at your level?" She's pointing at the 60-year-old senior VP of a global multinational company. "How do I start out at your level?" she says. And she's not joking. And he looked like he'd been slapped in the face, and he kind of, blinked and stepped back. And he says, "Well, now you have to have something to bring to the table." He's trying to be polite. He's a guest in this class, and they've asked this crazy question. And he said, "You have to have some experience, for example." Another kid pops up his hand and says, "Well, now how can I get that experience? Can I read a book or something?"
Wow.
And they're not kidding. So the idea that this instant gratification, as you said, I call this time compression. It's a different sense of the pace of life, which has changed from the baby boomers to the millennials and younger who grew up in this fast spinning, fast churning digital world. So I think that's important. And another aspect to that is that they also, this 1 year year end evaluation of how they're doing is completely off with their pacing schedule. They want more instantaneous feedback in terms of how they're doing and also the steps toward how to work their way up. And I think that if some of these young folks saw what the path was toward getting that promotion, or maybe there can be half steps implemented by companies, so there can be sort of a meet you halfway program implemented by companies that want these young workers, but they want more specific feedback in a shorter period of time, and they also want more clear steps. For example, in the universities, they'll ask us now for rubrics. Instead of saying, well, here's your semester paper or your semester project, they say, well, where's the rubric? So they want kind of a step by step broken down, how do I get there program laid out for them by us as professors, but in the workforce, I think, toward that promotion. And I think that would help with the retention that you were talking about, where they peel off in 18 months or less because they don't see that pathway to the promotion.
That is so insanely different than it was when I started out working night and day, 180 out. Which,
Right.
I think for a lot of companies, especially you hear about these companies that have a lot of openings, and some of them are, I think we're our own worst enemy in this industry in some cases, because everybody has that expectation of a degree, and that's sort of the defining line. But you see a lot of kids nowadays that are dropping out of school and becoming their own bosses because they see that as the fastest path to get to where they want to be, probably in a number that is monstrously different than even 10 years ago.
That's right. And that's another aspect of this, what I call coming untethered, is that young people that grew up in this environment are unhooking from traditional activities, behaviors, social structures, including things like getting married, buying a home, buying a car, having kids, being part of a church, joining a political party, or other sort of community groups like the Rotary or the local golf country club or any of these sorts of things. So, that's one of the aspects of it, is that these kids are just coming unhooked. And one of them, as you said, is going to college. So that also has other implications, because these students coming unhooked also means coming unhooked from the workplace. Because they have a laptop and they can work at Starbucks or anywhere else, they say, well, why do I have to come in on a regular basis? Why can't I work from home or from Starbucks or from beachside at Bali, in fact? And so,
I'm for that one.
yeah, so these students, 3/5 of students think they have the right to work remotely and the right to have a flexible schedule. So the vast majority, 7 out of 10 students, believe that being in an office isn't even necessary anymore. So, this, as you said, this is a sea change compared to, let's say, the baby boomers' sense of going to work and showing up and all that. This untethering has massive implications for their perception of what work is and where it's done.
Well, to be fair, I will say that one of the problems I think inherently in the tech industry, especially where women are involved, is that expectation of having to be at an office 8 to 5 or longer. Actually, there is no 8 to 5 job in tech that I've found, but the expectation that somebody has to be in an office, and companies that really want to change the structure and have a greater diversity, that's one thing that they often overlook, is the fact that there's a lot of jobs that can be done remotely or partially remotely. I personally have worked remotely for 20 years, but tech as a whole kind of does it not the best job of using tech to solve some of their problems. And so the attrition rate for women in tech, last thing I read, was like 67%. And a lot of that is because they're leaving to be caregivers because the time's just not afforded them.
Mhm.
So, that might be kind of a byproduct of this untethered world that might actually bring about some change that's, to
Well,
be fair, probably long overdue.
I think that you're getting into some interesting territory here, and that is that part of the work we've been doing at Infrastructure Masons and things that I'm hearing across the industry is we want to have a more diverse workforce. We want to attract women. Another fellow that I teach with here at USC was the CTO of Northrop Grumman, and he's a wonderful engineer. And we sat down at lunch one day and we were talking about these issues, and he said, I had the most women of any team at Northrop Grumman long before anybody else was doing that, and we had the strongest results and the best outcomes. He said because diversity brings more diverse experiences, and he says engineering is based upon analogy. And you can have more analogies when you have more diverse experiences, which lead to better engineering solutions. So, the idea of diversifying your workforce isn't simply a nice thing to do. The studies show that it actually enhances the bottom line. The companies actually make more money, women in leadership positions and things like that, because I think that you see blind spots, you see novel solutions to things. So, that's one of the keys. And tying this in again to this concept of coming untethered, we have now a huge uptick in babies being born to single mothers because people aren't getting married. So, one of the factors to consider if you want to attract more females into your company, you may want to think about childcare. Because if you've got more single mothers raising kids, that's going to be on top of mind for them. So, again, it's this sort of rethinking what is important, what will attract and retain a young workforce. And I think these are some of the things to think about: the ability to work remotely, the ability to work flexible hours, and possibly considering childcare to attract young women.
Yeah, Nancy was on here. Nancy Novak, I know you know her.
She's
Um,
wonderful.
yeah, she is. One of the things that she brought up was that in hiring practices, men look at a young woman and think, "Oh, she's going to leave me for maternity leave." And if you just normalize that and gave both young men and young women maternity leave in equal measure, that kind of takes that off the table, which I thought was kind of a brilliant idea, actually.
Well, I'll tell you what, I just gave a talk at Google about these sorts of issues. And to prepare for that, I polled my students and we talked about the perks and the benefits. And they looked at some of the ones that were being offered by tech companies and they said, if you want to say that men and women are equal, why do they have differences in maternity versus paternity leave? I mean, they said to us, you're not walking the walk. You're just saying something, but you're not really doing it. I thought, wow, that's really insightful. So, I brought that to them, but that's exactly what they said. Why don't you have equal time for maternity and paternity leave? And that kind of thing signals, by the way. One of the other gals said, I look at the board of directors and I look at the company, at their leadership. If I don't see, women, I don't even apply. So this idea that you're signaling things online, on LinkedIn, on your website, that young workers are looking at and reading the tea leaves, saying, is this for me? Is this an organization that's friendly to diversity? That's friendly, and they're looking at these, differences in policies, saying, "Meh, maybe they're not really that evolved, or that's not a good fit for me. I don't see any women. Meh, maybe not for me." So it's very important for companies to understand their public-facing communications. These kids that are so digitally savvy are looking at those for clues to the company values to see if they fit with their own.
And I would say not only just having women on the board and women in leadership positions, but what they do in leadership positions outside of their traditional one or two that happen to have been out there for some time. But one of the things that we talk about is in order for all of this to happen, HR really needs to make a massive change. And I've heard about how people don't really have any luck filling out resumes and sending them through ATS systems, and that even the way job descriptions are written, sometimes they appeal more to men than they do to women.
Oh, yeah.
And there's lots of nuances to that. And for HR to really stand up and decide to make a difference, it's not a passive thing. And it's not, what some men say, oh, just put it out there and let diversity fall where it may. It's an active, conscious change. And I think that diversity includes not just women, but young folks and millennials and things. But I think it definitely, HR really needs to react to this, don't you think?
Well, yes. The studies are showing, for example, like you said, the way that they're putting it out there, it's kind of like a magnet. What is it you're attracting? And what they found is that if you write up a job description and it uses a keyword, you're much less likely to get women even applying. And that keyword is the word aggressive. When women read a job description and they're looking for an aggressive individual, that's almost a code word for a male. And that's how they take it. So they say, nah, once again, they're reading the tea leaves. It's like, not for me. They're looking for a guy. So what they found is if you replace the word aggressive in these tech ads and use the word assertive, you're going to get a lot more women applying to that job. So it can be as simple as that. It doesn't have to cost millions of dollars. It can be just the positioning of these job ads that makes the difference.
Well, and there's been a huge disservice too, I think, with some of the folks that do the resume writing and they try to anomalize a resume and tell, women, use your initials, don't use your name because this identifies you as a woman. And so for the companies that are trying to make a difference, it's kind of counterintuitive to making that difference. But realistically, 85% of jobs are still filled through networking. And we network with who we hang out with.
That's right. And
So
I think that's a key. I saw a young woman online, in fact, in a women's sort of business group type thing saying, I'm applying for all these jobs. I'm not getting them. And, I suggested spend more time going to network events, go to meetup groups, go to conferences, spend your time on that as opposed to cold resume sending. And that's where you're going to get a job opportunity. So I think that's the other thing is how do we integrate particularly young women, folks of color, into these networking opportunities and bring them into the fold? Because you're right, most of the jobs are filled through the Who You Know program.
And if you have a machine that tells you have to tick 12 boxes to even be considered, then you're probably wasting your time. And it's a shame because there's tons of venues out there for different things you can subscribe to, lots of different people that'll tell you how your resume should look. You could literally probably every person you send it to will give you some tip about why it's not good and it needs to be changed. And I think there's ways for companies to reach out. And I think we also have to be open to other things that since companies don't want to pay relocation, they sort of expect employees just to fall in their lap.
That's right. Well, I think that's right. I think, again, the idea of attracting employees is one thing. And I think the retention of them is another. And, I've said that I think that the workplace may be one of the last bastions of places where young people can anchor themselves and to be integrated into an organization. And why this is so important is, what I know from the long-term old school sociological studies is that all these organizations like marriage and family and church, all these things I was talking about that young people used to routinely take part in, and now millennials are unhooking from these things. These are stabilizing social structures. So what we're seeing now is a 30-year high in things like anxiety and depression and loneliness amongst young people. Example, half of Americans now are not in any kind of romantic relationship, and more than a quarter of millennials say they have no friends at all. So this is driving some of these anxieties and depressions. So point being that the workplace needs to rethink how it integrates these employees, where it's not just do your job and go home, but how can they be a part of sort of a work family, if you will. And a lot of young people are talking about the work fam, that's where they're finding that kind of connection and stability that they used to find in places like the church, that fellowship idea. So I think that's another arena that the workplace can rethink in terms of how to attract, how to retain, and also how to retain a healthy workforce physically and mentally by helping to provide a place to anchor and connect with others in the workplace.
I will say, having worked remotely for a long time, and I've known lots of other folks that have worked both remotely and in an office, if you're part of the remote part of a company, you feel left out when you see all the notices for company picnics and stuff come up when
Right.
they're 22 states away, and you
Right.
think, that would be a fun thing to do. I was lucky enough that I traveled, so I was always hanging out with somebody from the company and kind of had that connection. But I've known a few people that started out working remotely and ended up leaving that job in favor of going to an office because they really, really missed that interaction. And that was a big part of their day and a big part of kind of feeling complete.
That's right. I think that it becomes hard to manage people remotely. They're just not quite, for example, we do a lot of remote meetings with infrastructure masons, but our wonderful leader, Dean Nelson, he's always insisted that we do Zoom meetings. And it makes a difference to see the faces. And, our executive director, Simon, is over in London. And, I can wave to Simon and see his face and we smile. And it's a way for us to bond, even though we're at a distance. And it makes a difference. It's not the same thing if you're on the phone, and even less so if you're just sending a text or an email. But a lot of young folks are increasingly, for example, teenagers now, they speak more to their friends via a device than they do face to face.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
yeah, so there's a lot less of this interaction going on, and then a lot less skill around socializing and talking and things like that. So that's another thing that the workforce can do, the workplace. It can provide a space and opportunity for people to mix and mingle and sort of practice these socialization skills, which become important when you're working with vendors or sales or outside people that you need to communicate with. All these communication skills become very important to success, both individually and as a company.
I've got a 15-year-old granddaughter who I see the top of her head more than I see her face, which is horrible to say, but it is kind of a catch-22, right? These kids want to do everything on a phone.
Right.
They want to work remotely.
Right.
But then how are they supposed to get socialized? And outside of a like button on some social app, it's really kind of sad. I think the next big social app is going to be something where where it's more like a Zoom, where people can be better connected doing some of those things. It's just, I really feel like we're sort of stuck in a downward spiraling circle where everybody wants to be so disconnected. And then they realize a little too late that connection is something we all need. Humans, I think, as a whole, just need that.
Yeah. Well, we've certainly evolved over eons to be social creatures. I mean, that's what's perpetuated the survival of our species. I'm not an evolutionary psychologist, but I do believe that, and that we are paradoxically more connected by our devices and social media and texting, and yet at the same time more disconnected than ever before. So I think that's the other thing that companies can do now is, and that young college students are sort of crying out for, is integrate wellness and physicality and things like that into the workforce. For example, my students are talking about having yoga available at work, or meditation, or even therapy and counseling, and a health clinic, these kinds of things they're asking for. Maybe a gym or intramural activities, like maybe y'all have a softball league that you play on together or something, where there's opportunities to be well at work, and that it supports and encourages that kind of thing. And also the idea of being together. And that's one other thing that's being driven by our devices, is that life for young people is being driven indoors. So the idea that, spending time in nature, spending time outdoors walking outside, for example, getting some sun. These kinds of things can also be very healthful. And if employers have an opportunity to do an offsite in a place where they can walk together and talk together and be outside in nature, that's another way that they can sort of improve the health of young people while also creating the bonding and connection amongst the workers.
Well, I'm a firm believer in that the beach is kind of like God's value. It's very restoring to me. Some
Yeah.
people prefer the mountains. I'm definitely a beach girl, but
Yes.
certainly I think, there's a lot of kind of outside of the box solutions to this, but the new kids, I say the new kids, the kids that are probably 10 to 18 in that range, I really think they're getting worse as far as being stuck in their devices. And I told my granddaughter, I said, if you really want to make a difference in your life moving forward, you will learn how to look somebody in the eyeballs and have a conversation.
Right.
Because it's kind of a lost art.
No, it is becoming a lost art. And in fact, that's what one of the sorority moms that lives with the girls on campus said to me. She said, they've lost the art of conversation. I said, really? And she says, yeah, they quickly run out of things to say, and then they pick up their phones and start texting someone else. So that's what I'm saying. The workplace is going to have to socialize some of these skills that, let's say, the baby boomers who didn't grow up in this environment take for granted. And these skills can include making a phone call. For example, I had my students make a phone call a bit back with one of the marketing directors to a large automaker, and they were going to develop a semester project together. And I talked to the guy on the phone. He was funny. He was personable, nice guy. And so I thought, okay, great. This will work out great. So I went to class and I said, hey, give this guy a call, set up a call, and I'll give you his email, and then call him up as a group, work out your project. And then at the end of the semester, you're going to pitch him your ideas. Great. Next week, I come back. I said, well, how'd the call go? Not very good. Well, what happened? There was an awkward silence. I'm like, what awkward silence? And I racked my brain thinking, did I hear an awkward silence? And then I realized they called up this guy as a group and said nothing. And I went, oh my gosh, they don't know how to make a phone call. So they're not experienced with this kind of thing. When the iPhone came out, 10% of the time people used apps, and 90% of the time they used it to make phone calls. Well, now that's reversed. Only 10% of the time is the phone used to make phone calls, and the rest of the time is social media apps and all these other things. So they simply lack the experience in things that, let's say, the baby boomers going into the workforce would have taken for granted. So that's another thing that the workplace can do. You might have to step back, and that's what I realized. I called my brother in to give a 101 how to make a phone call with a cold client, a cold call, how to break the ice, things like that. And he gave great ideas for that. He's a top sales manager in the world for his company because he's an expert at that. So he brought some of those skills and training to the students. So the workplace is going to have to give some of these 101 how to break the ice, how to interact with people, training for these students who simply lack the experience in face-to-face, non-mediated communication.
Well, and colleges and all the different ways that kids learn, there's so much of that. Schools now give out iPads instead of textbooks in junior high.
Oh, yeah.
Everything's on a pad.
Yep.
Everything is phone connected. When I was in school, they taught home ec. You understood how to balance a checkbook. There was business outreach that taught you how to dress for an interview, taught you how to write a resume, taught you how to have a phone call. And we're missing a lot of that these days. And the sad part is that a lot of people that are baby boomers my age are the ones that own these companies and the ones that are going to be interviewing these young kids. It's kind of a shame that this disconnect exists because we raised a lot of these kids.
Right.
You understand how to talk to your own kids, but certainly moving to the younger generation, it's sometimes I catch myself looking at my grandkids, and if we're doing an activity, I make it a point we tie-dyed shirts last time they were here.
That's fun.
But just to have something fun to do with them.
Yeah, hands-on.
To get that interaction.
Yep. No, that's really true. And I think, you're tapping into something is that when early on, when I was studying all this impacts of the internet, a lot of the talk was about the digital divide. That, for example, lower socioeconomic status folks and minorities, for example, would not have access to computers, access to the internet. And the idea was they were going to get left behind as the ship sort of took off without them, leaving them standing at the dock while everyone else is on the ship of opportunity. And at this point in time, because obviously the price of technology drops, as we know, over time, it's become so easy to get a smartphone, internet-enabled smartphone. It turns out now that studies are showing that lower income folks, minority folks, actually are on screens more than upper income or white kids, for example. So I think this is a new digital divide that's emerging. And if you look at some of the private schools that the kids, for example, of the tech scions go to, like the Waldorf schools in the Bay Area, they don't have screens. They are in there doing, like you're talking about, hands-on crafts and arts. They're doing music. They're doing movement and dance. So their brains are being wired in a different way than kids that are on screens 24/7. And in fact, parents of these kids say that the television is also going almost constantly. So there's constant noise, constant stimulation, and constant digital entertainment and information coming in at a very fast pace. And so it's really going to reshape the brains of these young people being online all the time. So I think it is up to the teachers and the parents to carve out some sacred spaces like you did intuitively with your grandchildren doing this hands-on craft. That's a fabulous idea. Playing outdoors, outdoor sports, cooking together, even having a family meal together without devices. I think these times are going to be very important and more important than ever now as we're starting to see some of the negative effects of constantly being online showing up amongst our young people and our young workers.
I wholeheartedly agree. I just think that this rubber band effect of we push so hard for everybody to have a 4-year degree, and now we have ridiculous amounts of student debt. We push so hard for everybody to be digital, and now kids are forgetting how to have a conversation.
Right.
I really think that rubber band effect is just kind of snapping back, and there's going to be a few folks that are going to require a little handholding, I think, as we get back. Well, not necessarily get back, but you know what I mean, regain some of those lost skills.
That's right. And I think that's the thing. We got, with the unveiling of the iPhone and, Steve Jobs on that stage that day, how exciting that was that you could, have a phone and have the internet and everything, email on your phone. We came bolting out of the barn like a horse race. And I think enough time has passed now that we can kind of step back with a critical distance and sort of reevaluate where we're at and say to ourselves, is this where we want to be? And if the answer is no, recalibrate, and again, I've said this before and I'll say it again. I'm not trying to throw out our devices. Our worlds are increasingly being interjected with smart things and networks and things of that nature. And we're never going to get away from it again. This is our digital era. But I think that recognizing that within that, we're still human. We still have needs for socialization and for being together and for connecting and being a part of a group. And I think that those kinds of things, we need to bring that back in. And again, I think that the workplace may be one of the last bastions to be able to do that. And so HR and managers and all really need to think about how to consciously and intentionally bring some of these things back so we have a happier and healthier workforce that sticks around.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical for mental health. Not trying to get political by any stretch of the imagination, but you certainly see the effects through some of the gun violence in schools and some of the other things that are happening, that we're not taking care of psyches anymore. We're taking care of digits. And, how ironic is it that a conversation is probably the last bastion of privacy?
Right. And the other thing to think about, and companies might not have sort of put two and two together here, but when you think about, for example, we talk here about cybersecurity and cyber physical security in systems in the engineering school. And one of the top threats to a company is the disgruntled employee. So if you can bring some happiness, bring some connectedness to that employee, you're actually creating a safer workplace and a workplace that has less threat for some kind of cyber or physical attack. So that's really something to think about. This, again, isn't just a nice thing to do. This is going to have some very serious implications for safety and security for your companies.
I wholeheartedly agree. Wholeheartedly agree. Well, we are bumping up close to our time, although I swear I feel like we could sit here and talk about this forever. But if you wanted to leave folks with some parting words and some things to really think about when we're trying to attract diversity in tech and more women in tech and millennials and Gen Zs, and because all of that is diversity, right? It's a different way of thinking. And if we hire only people with 4-year degrees, they've all learned the same thing in the same textbooks. So we lose a lot of that vision and we lose all those different lenses that people see through. But if you're going to leave everybody, not discounting a degree by any stretch, I'm just saying there's other ways to learn.
Right.
But if you wanted to leave some people with some parting notes, what would you put in there?
Well, I think there's some really interesting also alternatives to the 4-year degree cropping up. There are, for example, fab labs that are springing up all around the world where kids are getting some hands-on digital fabrication, 3D printing, and all sorts of things like that, experiences. And there's a system of digital badges that are becoming available online where you can see what kind of skills these kids have. Take a chance on some of these alternative learners and alternative students. And I think that you'll find that it enriches the workforce to have, the vets that might be a little bit older. They've got a lot of great hands-on experience. To have women, minorities who bring different points of view to the workforce. Again, novel engineering and building and coding solutions because they have different analogies to draw from. And just really understanding that. And my book, Left to Their Own Devices, will also give you some insight into how their values and behaviors are changing, so you can sort of rethink your approach to hiring, attracting, and retaining this new untethered workforce.
And I'll put a link to your book in the description for this podcast for everybody. It's also available on Amazon. Julie just found out that she's on the Forbes top 30 for her book. So congratulations there. But it's an amazing read. If you haven't read it, it really speaks to that. And I think, one byproduct of this that we really might see making a change that solves several of the problems we've talked about today is new rise in apprenticeship programs and
Right.
taking some of these kids under your wing, and they can end up getting skilled without massive amount of debt. And I think we talk about different socioeconomic backgrounds. I think that's a great equalizer to be able to take some of these brilliant minds that may or may not have college as an easy path for them and be able to bring them up and teach them the skills they need without that massive amount of debt too.
That's right.
So Julie, I want to thank you so very much for your time today. For everybody listening, I look forward to hosting you on the next version of the podcast. Again, Julie's book is Left to Their Own Devices. You can find it on Amazon. Well worth the read. And we look forward to probably her next book. Julie's available. Like I said, she's a board member of Infrastructure Masons, which is an organization that does provide a lot of scholarships, and they have dedicated 50% of those to women. We've talked about them on this podcast several times before, but there's a link to them on the website too. So thanks everybody for listening. And Julie, thanks again for your time.
Much for having me.